discrimination. Foundation initiatives focus on uplifting voices that cannot be heard in order to help reduce systemic barriers through education, advocacy, and legal tools. I would now like to turn it over to Morgane.
Okay, there, I figured out how to unmute myself in this other technology. Thank you very much, Todd, for the very nice introduction. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming in to participate in this workshop. I'm going to try to keep it to under 45 minutes of my ramblings, and then I will we'll have time for some questions and answers. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that Richmond is on the lands, the unceded lands of the Musqueam Nation. And as I talk about resilience and I talk about human rights, I'm mindful that the rights of the people whose lands we're on are still struggling to be met today. And there's a lot of work to be done left on this matter. Okay, I'm going to try to see if I can minimize this window here. There we go. Okay, so the Morgane Oger Foundation works to narrow the gap between Canada's laws and the experience of those experiencing systemic discrimination, particularly in Canada, but we're also active overseas as well. We use education, advocacy, and legal tools to get our work done. We've got a few human rights cases on the go at any time, trying to set important precedent. So to talk about resilience in the trans lens, we have to talk about oppression. So I'm going to do a real quick recap on systemic oppression. Oppression has levers that help justify it and bring it in. We have ideological oppression. Basically the idea that those people are against the rules. We have institutional oppression, which is when the institutions refuse to act or fail to act. We have interpersonal oppression. Usually it's a reaction to others that has a lot to do with people feeling threatened by the existence of others and taking inappropriate acts that oppress them in order to do what they think is needed to do to basically like to keep their island safe, let's say. And then we have internalized oppression, which is when we don't believe ourselves. We've been taught or we've been groomed to take something as it is rather than make it better. And we have internalized privilege. Check your privilege is something that we hear a lot. We don't necessarily have a really objective lens on the situation, and there's a significant amount of oppression that comes from others thinking that their oppression of others is perfectly justifiable. And the way oppression is cultivated, it's through pathologization, calling people sick or delusional or unhinged. This is particularly relevant for queer communities, of course. We've got demonization, which is one of the oldest examples of this that we know of is blood libel, which is the accusation that you're stealing the blood of our children, which is impossible to prove to be false. But it was first known to have been used against the Jewish community in Spain, and it's very, very effective. We've got predator myths and conspiracy theories focused around the evil other, whoever that other might be. We've got vilification, which is a close cousin, calling people disgusting, awful, and violent. When we justify discrimination based on these things, it's motivated, we tend to consider it motivated by hatred, which is shorthand for using these three types of characterizations. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court of Canada uses pathologization, demonization, and vilification to decide whether something is hatred. It also has to be intense. So I'm going to talk now about vicious circles. Now here we're going to talk about the vicious circle as it impacts trans people, but specifically, generally, my thing stopped working. Where's the rest of it? So we have bias. All of us have bias. It's built into us. It's been taught. And from the bias, we get to oppression. The oppression is how we actually take away opportunity from others. And then from the oppression, we get to harm. The people are harmed by this oppression. And this harm causes a sense of alienation. And this is the beginning of the vicious circle, which you can see that causes delinquency or antisocial behavior or visibly negative behavior, which of course is the tie-in between the root cause, which is the bias, and the consequences. So when we talk about oppression, we want to get, and getting rid of it, we talk about two things. A, we want to change the systems, and B, we want to reduce the harms. And these are often two different issues. Harm reduction is in the services usually. Systems change is in politics and policy and legal tools. So let's have a quick look at what anti-transgender oppression looks like in numbers. If you browse at the list here, so these are from surveys. Survey data is imperfect, but it gives a good idea of the pulse of people and how they feel. 77 transgender people out of, in a large sample of over 15,000 people were in the sample, had seriously considered suicide. 93% of them, however, dropped suicide attempts when strongly supported by parents. We have 73% of the transgender people surveyed had been targeted by mockery. 50% of the surveyed people lived on less than $15,000 per year, and 20% had been physically or sexually assaulted due to their gender identity or expression. And oppression is physical, it's emotional, it affects survivability. It's a multifaceted pressure point against people's well-being. Now, to fight off oppression, we want to achieve resilience, right? We want to have people be strong and on their feet. So first of all, let's talk about what we mean by resilience. There's generally resilience of communities, the sustained ability of communities to withstand, adapt to, or recover from adversity. Often we're centered on health, physical, behavioral, social, and environmental well-being. It's a big part of resilience. Healthy communities is what we're talking about. Resilience is the ability to bounce back when things don't go as planned. That's very much that way for individuals. I'm going to move this up here so I can see better. For example, according to Suzanne Kobas, a psychologist who's been studying resilience, the three key elements that resilient people possess are challenged. They're challenged by things. They're able to meet challenges. They have commitment, and they have control. Now, this is more of an organizational behavior lens, but essentially it's the ability to take on new things rather than to be despondent. It's the commitment to do it and the ability to actually affect your environment and to change the situation. So society has created a series of levers to affect to give us resilience. One is legislation, which is explicitly speaking is the rules. And then the legislation justifies institutions and programs, and that's where things are executed, ideas come into play. And then we have jurisprudence, and that's the legal frame that sets out the boundaries to make sure that people are playing within the rules set out by the legislation when they're executing the legislation's ideas. And there's the culture, which is a realization of what we're working on. A resilient community is one which is well integrated into the culture, whatever the culture is, whatever the context, whether we're talking about cis-normative, heteronormative culture of that Canada is when we're looking at the LGBT lens, or whether we're looking at the white dominant culture when we're looking at racialization and resilience of racialized persons, or when we're looking at sexism and patriarchy, and we look at it, there's a dominant group and a less dominant group, and the resilience is as the tendency to be out of the tendency to not have the ability to have power is reduced, and that gives you more resilience. And the result of all of this is healthy communities where people are respected, where they are known to be within their rights, where they have the supports they need, and where we know where the boundaries are. So, as promised, this is a little bit heavy on the law and the legislation, and then it talks about we're going to talk a little bit about the programs that exist. I'm going to give links to programs available for follow-up. So let's talk about the lawmaking milestones that added resilience for the trans community and the greater 2SLGBTQ plus community as a whole. So people of diverse sexual orientation or gender identities. So in 1982, a new foundational document came through, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this Charter of Rights is kind of interesting when you are a human rights geek like I am. So it was enacted in 1982. It came into full force in 1986, and it implements the UDHR and CEDAW, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the oh my goodness, the Commission on Equality of All Women. I'm having some difficulties with my next buttons. Okay, so the rights and the freedoms protected are the fundamental freedoms, which is a list. We have a democratic rights. We have the mobility rights. We have equality rights. And we have the official language rights and the minority language education rights. What's interesting about the Charter, and not a lot of people know this, is that it only applies to governments and to their institutions. So you can't apply the Charter on an individual. It's only government, and you can't apply it on a corporation. It has to be an institution of the government. So in 1996, the Canadian Human Rights Act was amended to specifically include sexual orientation as one of the prohibited grounds of discrimination. So this inclusion was a clear declaration by Parliament that the LGBT community are entitled to an opportunity equal with other individuals to make for themselves the lives they're able to and wish to have, basically equality. The next big thing came in legislation in Ontario. This is specific to the trans people. So all these were the enumerated list, and we added gender identity or expression in 2012 in Ontario. And that actually had quite an impact because it showed that it could be done, and it gave the other provinces a little bit of time to stall and to figure out what they would do because they didn't really want to do it at the time. And then they saw that there were, data was gathered, as is done with legislation, until in 2016, BC added gender identity or expression as well. This is under the Christy Clark government. In 2017, Bill C-16, the federal human rights change came in. Jody Wilson-Raybould brought it in, and it added gender identity or expression to the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. And it followed two attempts to get this done. There was Bill C-398 and then Bill C-279. And I'm bringing these up because there's a lot of claims that Bill C-16 was snuck in under the radar. There had been a trans rights bill in Parliament for almost a decade, every year. Now, keeping on going to human rights legislation now, Canada actually adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And that entitles us all to the same 30 fundamental rights. And that's where we get the right to live free from all forms of discrimination, which was brought into the Charter. So it's implemented differently in federal and provincial contexts, and this is important to know. Federally, things are under the Canadian Human Rights Act, and provincially, it's under the BC Human Rights Code for British Columbia. And the context is about how it's regulated. For example, banking and air travel are federal jurisdictions. The RCMP is a federal jurisdiction, whereas schools or the Vancouver Police are municipal or provincial jurisdictions. Which means that depending on who did something that hurt your feelings or that discriminated against you, there's a different context. So the Canadian Human Rights Act is the federal document that sets the rules. The Canadian Human Rights Commission receives the complaints, and that should say the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, apologies, I have a typo there. And the information about the tribunal and so forth can be picked on here. And there was a link I put at the beginning, and actually, so this presentation is being made available online for people who want to follow through. If you don't have the link, please follow through with me to get it. So provincially, the British Columbia brought in the BC Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, and they oversee the BC Human Rights Tribunal, and they also oversee something called the special programs, which is, because it's the newest Human Rights Commission in Canada, after a 15-year hiatus when it had been closed down and then just restarted in 2018, the special programs aims to improve the conditions for an individual group that has faced disadvantages. And it's a way to get permission to discriminate on grounds where you normally wouldn't be allowed to discriminate. But you have to do it for a disadvantaged group, and that could be based on social or cultural or economic or political life. And this is the basis of the reasoning that the BC Office of the Human Rights Commissioner gives, which is that they see inconsistencies in who report experiences with discrimination and who has experience with discrimination. And we know that the people who face discrimination the most are not necessarily the people who put in the most complaints. And one of the reasons why that is the systemic and the institutionalized discrimination. And that's what this aspect of the Human Rights Commission provincially is there to deal with. So if someone wants to do a focused program, what one does is one applies to the commission to be able to focus, let's say, only on Italian-speaking refugees, let's say, and then you get permission to do that, and then you proceed with an otherwise discriminatory practice, but with essentially a license to discriminate. And it has to be focused, and it has to be with a clear reason to do it. Now, policies and institutions. The human rights law set out the expectations, and then organizations needed to create policies that reflected the newfound human rights protection that transgender people received, and before transgender people in the LGBT community overall. And let's keep in mind, a lot of these things I'm explaining here are also the tool that provides resilience to other communities, whether it's on the basis of discrimination on the basis of sex or of race or of gender. So in 2013, in British Columbia, a young girl, Harriet Cunningham, successfully convinced the BC government to change her gender marker to female from male for sex designation, which was the beginning of the clear cut in Canada that sex designation was gender. There was some jurisprudence about this before, and I'll talk about that later, from the 1990s, but this was the first policy decision to bring in a policy to recognize that gender identity and sex designation were effectively the same thing in Canada. What it did is it removed the surgical requirements from the birth certificate change. So it decoupled physiology or a physiology test from access to, affirmation that one is a girl or female in Harriet Cunningham's situation. In 2014, the Vancouver School Board adopted trans-inclusive policies, and those policies explicitly protected trans youth, and they took into account the mature minor doctrine, which is entrenched in the Infant Act, which protects youth right to privacy and to make their own medical decisions when medically necessary and when suitable, and to live life free of encumberment. And it was partly based on the School Act, which has a component in it that says that children are entitled to confidentiality with their teachers and their administration. Interestingly enough, Vancouver School Board did it publicly, but just before Vancouver School Board passed it, and it was very public, the Catholic School Board of Vancouver passed the same policy for their own schools, but they did it without ever mentioning the word transgender. They managed to write a whole policy that never acknowledged the existence of trans people. The Catholic faith doesn't really acknowledge transness. The trans-inclusive policy set out naming, set out respect of privacy, it set out the right to use washrooms and things like this, the daily lives of students. In 2014, the federal government started using gender-based analysis plus which is for all of its policy decisions, and this was a major policy component for resilience of transgender people and for a lot of people as actually. And we can see quite a shift from, let's say, pre-2014 and post-2014 actions of governments. So gender-based analysis, what's going on here? So, oh, you know what? I've got the wrong slide in here, wrong component. So under gender-based analysis, it requires policymakers to look at all of the intersectional factors when creating policy, and it provides a roadmap and a workflow for doing this work. It's very useful. And if you just type in gender-based analysis in Google, you'll find a very helpful help site from the federal government. In 2015, the federal government dropped the surgical requirements for gender marker changes. It's not widely known, but immigrants don't have a birth certificate. They have a federal proof of citizenship. And this policy made it possible for people who haven't had transsexual surgery to access federal identity documents, and therefore, most importantly, a passport. And it enabled children to access passports that represented that correctly represented their name and their gender identity, so that they didn't have difficult experiences at the border when their presentation and what it said in the passport didn't match. It had been stalled under Harper, and this is I think my most happy moment was when I got Immigration Canada, I think it was called at the time, Citizenship and Immigration Canada, to implement public policy with a tweet. So I reached out to the Human Rights Committee leader of the Canadian Senate, and with a question about whether I was getting special discrimination for a 1.5 year delay on getting my passport, and I had my passport the next day. So it was Twitter is surprisingly helpful when used correctly. So in 2015, British Columbia started looking at Transcare. It actually implemented the program over time, but it started working on in-house peer support, primary care, surgery and support, and local assessors. So in other words, not having to travel to Vancouver to get assessments for being trans. So basically, we're talking about accessing trans-inclusive medical care locally where you are, rather than having to go and travel to Vancouver, which is quite onerous. And with using local health providers, but all under a provincial level control, rather than using the local health authorities. Actually, I'll stay here. The outcome of this was that people ended up, it gave people a clear explanation, or a more clear explanation of what to expect. So from the point of view of resilience, it helped people go into their medical caregivers' offices knowing what to expect, and knowing what right looks like, and knowing what good looks like, so that they could then actually access it. And then there was a place to complain. And this goes back to this resilience component, which is where you have actually some power, because you have a place to complain to. And this is a really important part. In 2018, the BC government brought in the Human Rights Commission, as I mentioned. So that was a key aspect of policy, which was essentially to have a governing body that actually looked at ensuring human rights were looked after, rather than just a tribunal in which you went to fight it out after being discriminated against. So now I'm going to talk about the legal cases. And the legal cases are really important for transgender rights because they're emerging rights. And so it's important to understand where the basis is for equalities, for claims about equality, because resilience is based on claims. So who can start this without talking about the Persons case? Yesterday was Persons Day. For those of you who haven't heard of the Persons case, in 1927, a woman tried to become senator, and she was refused because she wasn't a person. Because in 1927 in Canada, women weren't persons. And the famous five put together a petition to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada in 1927 turned down women as persons. So they took the petition to the Great Britain Privy Council, which is basically the Queen's private council, and the Privy Council gave women personhood in 1929. And I mean, this is really strange, right, when you think of it about it. But that's what actually legislation and law is for. In 1995 and 1998, two cases that were really important, and they brought in sexual orientation as a charter recognized right, even though it wasn't explicitly listed in the charter at the time. This was really important because it gave the ability to say, even though it's not in the charter, it's read into the charter, which is, for example, the same thing for any other explicitly prohibited grounds of discrimination that's not included in the charter. It's brought into the charter by the Human Rights Act or the Human Rights Code, depending on the jurisdiction you're in. The Supreme Court went further and ordered the provinces to follow. And so, so it ordered the provinces to follow in the interpretation that even though it wasn't in the charter, it was explicitly protected. The Kimberley Nixon case against Vancouver Rape Relief is an interesting case. In this case, Kimberley Nixon held that she was discriminated against because she was refused membership in a club and employment, which was reserved to club members. And in that case, the outcome, in fact, was that actually one doesn't have a right to work for a club, and one doesn't have necessarily a right to be employed by an organization that has specific services. The grounds for allowing the discrimination was club membership, and that Vancouver Rape Society had every right to pick its own members. And because membership was a prerequisite to employment, one couldn't be employed. And this stands, and it's a valid argument. It's the basis of religious organizations, for example, employing believers. Now, it also predicts explicit protection of gender identity or expression in the BC Human Rights Code. It's hard to tell how that would be read today, but that hasn't been challenged. In 1999, there was the Ferris case, which was the first case of a trans person winning the right to use gender spaces. It was important because actually it wasn't on the basis of gender identity, it was on the basis of sex and on the basis of disability that she won. So since 1999, in BC at least, trans women are protected from discrimination under the Ferris case when it comes to gender spaces and gender services. The Dawson case in 2015 is an important case that talked about the refusal to provide a service. So in the Dawson case, Angela Dawson was in the city jail, and the police officer didn't believe her that she needed a very specific kind of medical care related to being post-operative transsexual, and the nurses refused to provide the care because they didn't believe that she needed it. And the tribunal found in her favor that actually refusing to, like, even if you don't believe someone is trans, it's not enough. You have to actually execute what is necessary, especially when it comes to care. Trinity Western in 2018 is a critical case when it comes to resilience and to right and entitlement, because this is the first case in which a court ruled that the freedom of religion to express and to perform your religion does not trump the right to be free of discrimination. And as the ruling said, approving or facilitating inequitable barriers could undermine public confidence in the Law Society's ability to regulate in the public interest. It was about a law school, and the Law Society, being the regulator, couldn't allow discrimination. I'm not going to play this. We don't have time for that. So in 2019, I was involved in a case against Bill Watko, and this case, again, reiterated that the right to live free of discrimination equals the rights to free expression and the right to practice religion. One doesn't get to do whatever one wants with one's rights, and the Charter of Rights applies to transgender persons, was basically the outcome of this case. This was very important because, well, the respondent is petitioning for judicial review, and maybe there'll be an appeal, but it's hard to tell. So the decision affirms the rights of transgender people to safety and dignity are essential human rights. Jessica Yanev in 2019, Jessica Yanev tried to essentially trick service providers into providing services that they didn't provide, and she tried to use the claim of being transgender as the reason why they had to provide the services, and her complaints were either dismissed or dismissed as a misuse of the tribunal because it was to create leverage. You shouldn't put out a human rights case if you're not if you weren't surprised that it happened. So you can't entrap people using human rights law. And secondly, and going into the detail, Jessica Yanev wanted us to have her scrotum waxed, and she went to organize to vendors who didn't wax scrotums. So it's the question of, if you're a bicycle seller, you can't be forced to make a cake. And anyways, her complaints were dismissed. However, there was one part of the complaint that was justified in here, which was that a provider refused to touch a transgender woman using religious ground, and the tribunal was clear that had the case been done better and not been done in an aggressive or predatory way, they would have allowed this ground. So you don't get to claim as a service provider that you don't want to serve trans people. That's not enough, and that's in of itself, regardless of what the service is, if the grounds is not a impossibility to do the work, or that it's not the work you do, you don't get to discriminate. In medical care cases, and this is really important for the resilience of trans youth, there have been 2 cases in which a parent has tried to block their child from accessing medical care that was trans-specific. One was accessing hormones, and the other one was accessing breast removal. And in both of the cases, the courts leveraged the Infant Act, mature minor doctrine. Like I mentioned before, it says that any youth 12 or above who is deemed competent to give consent by the medical practitioner has the right to give consent to necessary medical care, and that the conversation is only between the child and the doctor. Parents can be part of this conversation if they'd like to be, but the person who gives consent is the child. Trans medical care is the same as any other medical care in the end: vaccination, abortion, contraception, transplant. It was upheld at appeal, and it's locked in now. In 2021, just recently, a transgender, non-binary worker in a restaurant found themselves in an altercation about pronouns. Their choice of pronouns for referring to them with courtesy and dignity were not being accepted by their colleagues and by their employer, and this escalated, and the employee was fired over it, and wasn't fired for misconduct, was fired as retaliation for demanding something that the business didn't feel like giving. The tribunal found in their favor, awarded them a significant amount of money, and mentioned that refusing to address another person with courtesy, with such things, for example, as the pronoun they expect, is part of a toxic workplace. It's workplace harassment, and firing that person as a result of this is retaliation, and these things are explicitly forbidden in the Human Rights Code. Okay, so those are like the institutional components, and I'm going to get into what we still have to do, but I would like to recap at this point. So we touched on how basically there's three key parts of resilience, which is on the one hand, there's the laws that you have to build that create resilience. And then next, you have to have the policy that organizations use to apply the law in a way that is compliant with the law. And then you have to have the programs, or you have to have the services that support this. And then you have to have a way, and the reason why you need this is because, especially for transgender people, the idea is to be able to live your life without being bothered. But if people take it for granted that they can bother you, or that they can opt out of being courteous to you, then you're no better off if you don't have recourse. And so this is why it's so important that the law is there in the first place. And then you have to have inclusion, right? So the inclusion comes out of the programs and the policies that are stood up. For example, the availability of transgender medical care. For example, policies in all of our human relations teams where we work about the human rights criteria, or let's say the commitments and the requirements for dignified workplaces. And this helps people find themselves, especially when we talk about frontline services. If we're speaking about, for example, the emergency services for people, they need to be certain that they'll be looked after in an appropriate way. It might not always be the way they hope, but in an appropriate way. And then they need to be certain that they have a recourse, which is why the Human Rights Commission provincially was so important, which is why policies for people who are disenfranchised or who don't have agency, or as much as they could, like K-12 students in schools. And this is why medical care is so important. And now we're going to get into outstanding issues, because I have some things that we want to talk about in the last 5 minutes here before I pass this on to questions and answers. Oh, I'm going to close this thing. So we've all seen hatred online bringing about hate violence. And I wanted to show this really interesting graphic here. If you look on the slide on the left, you see in the Federal Human Rights Act, hate speech was removed. Section 13 of the Federal Human Rights Act was rescinded in 2013. So on the right, it's police reported hate crimes in Canada by year. My data here stops at 2017, but data after 2017, it rose some more and then it leveled off. And it's roughly leveled off above, slightly out of screen, but I didn't redo the slide for this event. What's kind of interesting here is when you notice the dates of these two articles. So in 2013, when the Human Rights Act was rescinded, it was actually right at the beginning of a period of rise of hate crime in Canada. So when we took away controls over what people were saying online, or when we took away the fear that there could be a repercussion for what you do, almost immediately we saw a significant increase in hate violence. And this is something that's really currently important. There are some federal measures coming in to address online hatred and to address to bring this back. And I think it's interesting. It's something we should all watch to see if it gets done, because I propose that if it happens, then the rate of hatred and hate violence will go down, which will show that it was successful. So we talked about transgender healthcare, and transgender healthcare has been, significantly improved in British Columbia, as I mentioned, but we still see that there are some gaps, and this is where work still has to be done. if you live outside of Metro Vancouver, if you're, you're going to have some difficulties accessing care, especially transsexual surgical care, because it's the difficult care is done in Vancouver, and you have to get back to your home. It's a little difficult. We have some providers that are openly advocating against transition care, which is unfortunate. The when you're an oppressed community, it's a little difficult to see people advocating that for the fact that actually you shouldn't get the care that the experts or that your community is asking for. And we continue to see trans elbow. Trans elbow is a fascinating phenomenon, which is that, let's say, if you hurt your elbow and you're trans, then the elbow can't be treated because the caregiver comes up with an excuse not to treat you. This is significantly less of an issue than it was, let's say, a decade ago or even 5 years ago. There's been a great deal of work done to sensitize caregivers, medical practitioners, social services practitioners about how to work with trans people and how to be a decent human being towards them. But we still run into a too high a number of complaints about this. And that's where I'm going to leave this to make time for a slide for questions and answers. I've got some resources, by the way, on the back of this while I go to Q&A, and I'm pointing it out because I'm going to give you the link to the slide deck for you to see. Is it possible? Did you, who's the moderator? Todd, did you have a chance to, can I give you a link to pass into the chat for people who want to catch?
Absolutely.
These two links here, where do I put them in? Am I able to access chat?
A chat should be on the bottom right-hand side, and you can send it out that way, or...
There you go.
Perfect.
Was that successful? That was successful. Okay.
Hey, Morgan, thank you so much. We are so appreciative. I see that you have some resources here, and so we can definitely get into those. Absolutely. I want to encourage folks, our audience, our participants here, to drop questions into the chat. And we're going to organize some of those ideas and go through and unpack some of that. We have about 12 minutes, so that'll be great. I have the first question here for you, if I may, and that is, where do I find support? Where can I turn to?
So it depends who you are, right? And what support we're talking about. So if you're a frontline server, if you're a frontline resource, if you're someone in the policy world and you're looking for support to do a good job, I would go to the Human Rights Commission and ask them for support. They're an excellent place to get help. I would also go to subject matter experts. I do this, but others do a very good job as well, and of basically doing trainouts and things like this to support in that way. I would also consider reaching out to peer organizations who are doing a good job. For example, the YWCA is doing a great job. City of Vancouver, I have some excellent resources there. Now, if you're a person, like a consumer, and you're run into a place and you need to get support, I would say the first place to reach out would be Transcare BC. That would be my recommendation. And I'll type it out in here. It's actually in the link of resources. Transcare BC is the provincial clearinghouse for everything related to physical and mental health for transgender persons. And it's a really good place to get information from them. Another really good place to go for the kind of support where you're scratching your head is a website called Trans Rights BC. And it's in the list of links. I think it's at the very top. Some lawyers have come up with basically simple explanations about where things stand. Is it my right to? Do I have to? Those kinds of questions. And all of the advice on that site has been vetted by lawyers.
Great. So we've got a...
I see some questions.
Yes. I've got the next one here for you, if I may. It's from a colleague here. So I work at the Olympic Museum. I wanted to ask if there's any tips for facilitating conversations around transgender inclusion in the Olympics and sport with our
Oh,
staff and guests.
right. So that's a bone of contention, right? So there's, you know, the the International Olympic Committee is motivated to provide fair, safe sports and and to do it at the highest level, right? That's what they do. And part of this is to, their approach is to have as much as many people qualify for sports as possible, by not having arbitrary reasons to get like to disqualify people from participation unless they get a clear unfair advantage for what they for their for a feature that they have. Human diversity is vast. There's an exceptional person for many, many reasons in every sports. If you remember, there was an Olympic swimmer not so long ago who had unusually long arms, unusually long fingers, and unusual blood oxygen concentration. And other people, for example, are transgender and wish to participate, but it has to be done fairly and safely, especially in contact sports, for example. And the International Olympic Committee is looking at that very carefully. So I would suggest a getting to know what the committee position is. They have an expert panel on sports medicine, I believe it's what it's called, and that panel is constantly reviewing policy about what is grounds for not being let into a sport for class. I would do that. Now that said, I would also address the conversation through a lens of inclusion and dignity. The conversation is very much about, um, do we, why sports exist and why do we try to manage and maintain dignity. Um, I could dive in for hours into the subject, but there was a time where every woman had to prove she was female with a medical exam to show physiology, and that was done away with because of because it was considered humiliating and it was considered oppressive and patriarchal oppression. And there, for the same reason, hard, fast requirements for participation in sports will definitely exclude people who shouldn't be excluded. And we want sports to be inclusive of as many people as possible. I think that's the approach I would take. Like and then maybe have some conversations about what if we used this feature? How many people, currently we have two classes of sports. We have men's sports and women's sports. If we observe that feature, let's go look at how many people who are currently in that category would be excluded today from that category if that was the hard and fast feature that was the qualifier. I think that makes an interesting conversation.
Hey, thank you so much. You're right. That's such a complicated question to unpack. We could spend a whole hour on it, I think. So we have another question here from a colleague. Um, it doesn't seem that the law policies align with the Human Rights Act, especially when it comes to LGBTQ2SIA plus freedom to live free of discrimination. How do we fight for laws or policies to change on an individual level or on a systemic level? Do you think?
Wow. So uh, that's a fascinating question. So, we don't change laws to meet the needs of individuals, right? Changing a law is a big deal. What we can do, though, is we can challenge a law in a court, right? Do a test case. For example, it's been suggested that recently suggested that we really need a test case on um, on is gender identity, protection on the basis of gender identity incompatible with the protection on the basis of sex in a society that has two basic sex assumptions, men and women, in which one group is overrepresented in the sexual assault of the other group, let's say. And that's an interesting question. And those kinds of questions, they have to be settled in courts. They're not settled in legislation. In legislation, legislation is very vague, and it doesn't ever talk about a specific sex, a specific race, a specific disability. It talks about discrimination on the basis of a disability, not a specific one. And doesn't and there's in our laws we don't actually give rights in our human rights law. There's no an example that's used a lot that's wrong is the example of mat leave, right? You have a baby, you go on mat leave, you're entitled to a certain amount of mat leave. And that's true, you are, but it's actually contractual with your employer. It's not a human rights entitlement. It's an accommodation expectation, and the right is to not experience discrimination because you gave birth. It's not because you're female or because you're a woman who gave birth. It's because you gave birth and you have that right. And the right is not to mat leave. The right is to not experience harm caused by the inevitable outcome of being in a class under the basis of sex. For example, some people because of their sex, some people give birth. And it's not based on you are of a certain caste or class. It's based on you cannot or you must be protected from harm because you're in that class, because you're in any class, let's say. I don't agree with you that law doesn't align with human rights. They're very consistent all the way through. Policies, though, they do have problems. There are lots and lots of policies out there that run afoul of human rights law, which is why the Morgane Oger Foundation helps people through human rights processes, is because they ran afoul. They were harmed by a policy that actually causes an injustice because of human rights issues. Here, addressing policies, again, it's the place of the course. Now, you can go and advocate to the organization who owns the policy to get them to change their minds. But in truth, usually they're invested in that policy and they don't see it. I'll give you an example right now where I'm involved in a complaint against the RCMP. I'm helping someone with a complaint, and it was regarding this person alleges that she experienced discrimination because she's First Nations. And she feels that it was really tangible. And the policy in place is to not mercilessly address discrimination because you're Indigenous. That's actually the policy that's in place that we're trying to force them to deal with. Checks and balances to prevent this kind of conduct. How is that policy not in place? It's because there's other policies where a police officer's word is much more valuable than a witness's word when there is a disagreement about what happened. And that's another policy, for example, right? These things are policy issues. And you can try to convince people to change policy, but usually policy is only changed by court order. And that's an unfortunate reality of our society. It's best to try to do it a different way, but it's hard, very, very hard to get an organization to change its ways. Before you try to go and get them to change their ways, I would go to subject matter experts to make sure that your understanding of what the policy is and your understanding of what's illegal in it is correct. I run across a lot of people who complain about something that doesn't actually exist. And that's a common problem, misperception about how policies and laws work and what exactly is on the ground. Entitlement is something that we could do with more education.
Hey, thank you so much for speaking to that. We we have lots of questions, some coming through, but perhaps this is a great place to leave us or wrap things up just for today. Um, and so the participant says, hi there. Thank you so much for your presentation today and taking the time to answer questions. Do you have any suggestions or resources regarding how to educate people about their use of language that can be considered transphobic or trans exclusionary?
Yes. Okay, I threw a link into chat. After this, I'm going to be in a free-for-all in a chat. Anybody can come in and ask more questions to follow up. Now, to answer your question about trans exclusionary, so it's, I don't want to say it's a fine line between a right to live with dignity and the right of someone else to be true to their soul. The law is clear. The law is clear, right? No one is entitled to be a jerk. There's no entitlement. But the law is also clear, and I want to talk about the law because it's important. The law is also clear. If someone follows you down the street, if someone follows me down the street and yells, "You're a man, you're a man, you're a man, 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 you're a man," there's actually almost nothing I can do about it because I don't have any law that prevents them from doing that, except if they just go too far. If they touch me, I can do something about it. If they harass me for days, maybe I can do something about it. But actually, if it's not because they're misgendering me, it's because they're just criminally harassing me. If no crime has happened, then between two human beings, that not in a service relationship and not in an employment relationship and not in a housing relationship, then actually there's no recourse. It's good to know that go from the start, because if you know there's no recourse, then you manage your expectations, right? Generally speaking, most people who don't have something profoundly wrong with their way of thinking respond to polite engagement saying, I don't know why you don't want to be nice to me. I prefer to be called like this. And if you can't call me like this, call me whatever you want, but not like that, right? And that's usually the engagement I do. So I have people who have very strong opinions about trans people all the time in my face. And my strategy is to matter-of-factly tell them what my pronouns are or correct them softly a few times. Never lose my cool. Very bad to lose your cool. It becomes all about you being crazy, right? So you never lose your cool, and then you just kind of engage by example and with mild correction. And if you're non-binary, it's harder to get through because a lot of people don't know what that is, right? I mean, I feel for non-binary people. They live their whole lives in a world where most people don't even know non-binary people exist. It's like binary trans 15 years ago. But I would say that I've had the most success telling people what my pronouns are and how I prefer to be treated and how I prefer not to be treated. And then telling them if they persist that if you keep on doing this, I'm going to stop engaging with you. And that usually goes a long ways. Did that answer your question?
I think those are some really great tips and some really great ideas there. I hope that's helpful to the participant. Morgane has included a Meet Google link in the chat. Thank you for doing that. That's so incredible.
Well, we'll see, right? I have to let them in. So, but yeah, presumably everybody will be courteous and decent, and strong arguments will be, if people have too strong arguments, then we'll have to end the session. So,
Disengage.
exactly.
Hey, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you to the entire group that's come out for this session of the Diversity Symposium. I have a bit of an exit script here, so folks, bear with me here. Yes, I really just want to take a moment here to share. If you're interested, please go and check out the other presentations being offered throughout the week at richmond.ca/diversity. You can still register into those sessions towards till the end of the week, Friday. Again, a big thank you to Morgane. And on behalf of the City of Richmond, Virtual Diversity Symposium, a big thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you have a great rest of the day. And do click that Google link and continue that conversation. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. There's 2 people in that room now. Okay, so I guess I'm going to go as well. So thank you very much. Are we finished with the event?
We are all done.
Okay. All right. I'm on 2 events at the same time, so I'm going to close the other one. I'm going to try to close the right one. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. That was amazing.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
That was awesome.
Thank you so much. Okay, you're all invited to go to the other one if you want. I'll be there. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
See you in a
Any
minute.
answers I can give, reach out on social media or wherever.
Okay.
I'm at your disposal.
Thank you, Morgane. Thank you. And Todd, thank you again just so much for the time that you've put into this and just your skill and an adept leadership of guiding a question and answer session. We really appreciate your participation. This has been lots of fun.
Really interesting. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks for all of your work. You folks make it look so easy, like having these extra chats open, and can't thank you enough.
Todd, we love working with you.
Thank you.
And next time I'll ask you to furnish my place.
I was just going to say a similar thing. Wow, I really appreciate this bookshelf that I see over on the left-hand side.
Oh my gosh. Thanks. Yeah, come on over.
The coffee table is really
yeah,
nice, Todd.
yeah. I really.
Thanks.
Yeah.
My partner made that coffee table, so it has
No way.
nothing to do with
Wow.
me. He's incredible.
Yeah. My goodness.
We'll have to have you all over for some drinks and food soon once we can sort of do those things.
I would love that.
Great.
Yeah.
All right.
All
Well,
right.
good luck with everything else going on. You're amazing, and I'm looking forward to being a participant.
Yeah, absolutely. You just did an excellent job. So thank you again, Todd.
Thanks.
This was just absolutely wonderful. So
Take
enjoy
care,
your
Todd.
afternoon. Don't work too hard.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Thank you, Lori. We appreciate all your hard work. That's amazing. I don't know how you do it.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Lori.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Today